I'm going to run a little bit more of an informal talk today. And I want to speak to you guys a little bit about the possibilities when you combine both bioarchaeology and archaeology together, and how you can use these different methods to reconstruct various things such as health, ritual, and society. And specifically, we'll be focusing on prehistoric northern Italy, which is what I did my master's dissertation on, and I've worked in various contexts around this area. So to start, I want to just mention to everyone here that this presentation will contain images of osteological remains, which might be sensitive for some viewers. There are osteological materials from children, so if you want to click away, there's no problem. I just want to let you guys know. So to set the stage, we are in the Pianura Padana, or the Po Plain, which is the valley that covers most of northern Italy. It covers approximately 46,000 square kilometers. And it spreads from the Western Alps all the way to the coast on the Adriatic Sea. And this valley is named, of course, for the Po River, which runs through it. And it is a major geographical feature that a lot of civilizations have lived around for millennia. So just to familiarize ourselves with what I'll be talking about. So first, we'll start with the Neolithic in the Po Plain, which runs from about 4,900 to 3,900 BCE, particularly the square mouth pottery fasces, which is a culture that has these very particular ceramics that have, of course, a square mouth. And if you've heard of the Venus statues that we've seen all over Europe in prehistory, one of the very famous ones comes from Via Guido Rossi, which we'll be talking about later, and you can see here. I'm uncertain if you can see my cursor, but it's there. Then we'll move to the Copper Age, which has two distinct phases. First, the indigenous Copper Age people of northern Italy, and then the bell beakers. And then we'll move to the early Bronze Age with the Polata culture, or the pile dwelling culture, where you can see a reconstruction here of the houses and a typical ceramic shape from the fasces. So for my thesis, I analyzed various burials from different sites in chronology, particularly around Parma, which is in the Po Plain in Emilia-Romagna. And I went through various phases, as you can see here, and I'm not going to focus too much on this because mostly what I want to talk to you about here is what evidence can we find from bones, and how does this help us see the bigger picture? So why are we combining this data? Well, typically on an archaeological excavation, you document the burial orientation, the position, the type of necropolis, the grave goods. And then later in the laboratory, you can determine the age at death, pathological markers on the bones. And typically these are published separately, but I think that it's very important to integrate this type of data, because when you integrate it, you can see a much bigger picture. And I'll give you guys two different ways that you can do this. So first, we'll start with a Neolithic to early Bronze Age transect, and later we'll go into an early Bronze Age to late Bronze Age transect using two different methods that you guys can see. So first, we start with Neolithic, and these are some of the archaeological data that were collected on various sites that you can see. So the sex statistics and burial positions, overwhelmingly in the Neolithic, the burial orientation is east to west. And this is true for both males and females, as well as children, which are represented in the necropoli at various age points. And here you can see a very typical square mouth pottery 1 site. So there's actually two phases of square mouth pottery. The first one is characterized by these very small burial grounds. Here you can see the burial ground at Foligno, and there's only 3 graves present at this burial ground, and this is quite typical of square mouth pottery 1. The burial grounds range from about 3 individuals to probably maximum 5 or 6 individuals. And you can see here the very typical crouched position laying on the left side for these individuals, and you can see that the remains are not fantastically preserved, but you'd be surprised how much information we can actually tell about them. If you notice here in Tomb 1, there are some grave goods, so we know that these people were buried intentionally and probably had some ritualistic aspects to the grave. Interestingly, this site and another one called Vico Fertile, which we'll explore later, both are connected to production spheres. So perhaps this is some sort of association with ritual and the production space, maybe a blessing of the ancestors. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So like I said, I want to focus mostly on kind of biographies of the dead with this first part of the talk. So we'll be going through various tombs and what we can learn from them. So this first one that you can see is at Via Borgonzi, where there were 3 tombs, one child, one juvenile, and one adult. And this is the child of 4 to 5 years old. And you can see that on the excavation, okay, you can find the burial position, you can see the orientation, but something that we noticed after we took it out of the ground is that this individual had a nonspecific infection or periostitis on the lower long bones. So this is the left and the right femur that you can see. And there's an enlarged detail with the microscope showing a nonspecific infection, which shows up as neodeposits of bone. And these neodeposits are likely due to some sort of blood infection. Children are actually more susceptible to nonspecific infections than adults because their periosteum is quite fragile. And so once a foreign body enters it, it causes a very intense reaction. As you can see here, it's covering both of the femurs, and it also was present on the single tibia. So we can't say that for sure this is the cause of death of this individual. But what we do know is that at some point, this individual became very ill from this infection. And there's no remodeling around the borders, which means this occurred fairly close to the time of death. If you notice the interesting skull shape of this individual as well, you can see that it's quite elongated, and this is because he has cranial stenosis, and one of the sutures fused early, and so this causes a strange morphological head shape. It's not pathological, it doesn't cause necessarily any problems for the individual, but it does cause this strange looking. Interestingly, this individual doesn't show any aspects of malnutrition. So even though he was sick at some point, it wasn't that he was sick due to being starved or having no access to food. It was likely an injury of some sort. Still within Vico Fertile, we have an interesting attestation of a ritual practice here. So this is tomb 2, in fact, at Vico Fertile. And I'll highlight here. Okay, that what we found is a snake that is placed along the coronal suture, and it goes down the middle of the cranium from the orbitals to the occipital, and it was in connection. So this is completely an anatomical connection. You can see a small detail here of the vertebrae. And we noticed this in the lab. So if we had excavated this on site and completely removed the cranium, we would not have realized likely that this snake was there. And it was actually found in 2 out of the 3 tombs at Vico Fertile, meaning that this is probably a ritual aspect. So we started asking ourselves, where else do we see this? Can we see this elsewhere? And in funerary contexts, we never see it again. But what we do find is actually 2 burials, one at Limose and one at Via Guido Rossi, which is a site I'll mention later, where you can see on the top here, these burials of 2 snakes in a ritual deposit. So snakes are not typically found underground in this position, which is similar to like a catechus, which is a typical snake mating position. And we have 2 different deposits in various sites in the Po Plain where these snakes were buried in this way, associated with figurines or other ritual items. So it leads to the question, why is the snake now being put on the cranium? Is this some sort of burial ritual? If so, why do we not see it other places? So I was just talking about Via Guido Rossi, where the snakes are from, and it's actually a later phase site. So it's from the Square Mouth Pottery 2. And this is characterized by community burial grounds. So you can see here all of these little tiny black dots in the corners over here. These are all burials. And the burial practice stays the same, in fact. People are still buried on their left side in the east to west orientation and still crouched. Men and women are both represented as well as children. But rather than 3 or 4 burials, it's actually the entire community. And one of the most interesting cases, in my opinion, at Via Guido Rossi is the case of Tomb 24, which is the third oldest case of Neolithic tuberculosis we have in Italy. And here you can see some lesions. The femur, one of the fingers up here, the metacarpal, one of the vertebrae, and the cranium. So the cranial lesions are actually not due to the tuberculosis, they're due to metabolic dysregulation. And so this individual had multiple bone tuberculosis, which affected nearly 95% of the bones in her body. And she was only 24 years old at her time of death. And this is interesting because tuberculosis occurs in phases, and it will keep recurring throughout your life if you don't treat it, which in the Neolithic, we don't believe they had a way to treat this. And so this individual, likely by the end of her life, was severely disabled and debilitated. And when we think about this, we think in today's standards, right? But if you think about the past, this is an individual who could not really participate in community life. She could not collect food. She could not do these things. Her hands were practically unusable. The joints could not move nearly at all. She had intense arthritis. It was likely very, very painful for her to walk due to her spine and her legs both being affected, as well as her pelvis. Yet she received one of the richest burials at the site. It had various vegetal offerings, including hazelnuts, faunal remains from some sort of funerary feast. There was a fire placed at her head where it appears they cooked something when she was deposited in the ground. And she was buried with various grave goods as well. So this was an individual that was valued heavily by her community. She was given a place of respect in the burial ground, yet she was a young woman. So it's not that she necessarily held a very prominent place in the society and then became debilitated. She was likely debilitated for many, many years. And the community still fed, cared for her, and loved her even after death in order to celebrate her life like this. Looking at other cases in Via Guido Rossi, we can see some various instances of paleopathology. So on the left here, I guess left for you guys, we have Tomb 4, which is a male in his 50s. And in the arrows, you can see some particular interesting facets. So on the femur here, there's a nodule, and this is associated with stress on the tendon of the femur. So these people were living really hard lives. They were carrying a lot of heavy weights. They were putting a lot of stress on their extremities. You can see this also in the spine, where he has some degeneration, though this can be from old age. You can see with the vertebrae here, which is starting to degrade. If you look at it in contrast with this middle one in Tomb 25, you can see a stark difference. Additionally, in Tomb 4, you can see porosity on the skull, which I think maybe is hard for you guys to see, but this is associated with metabolic crises events throughout this man's life, as well as some lesions on the ribs, which could be due to his old age because he has arthritis in some of his other bones, and it's likely that at the end of his life, he started to be affected by this. In Tomb 25, we have a slightly younger female. You can see here her pelvis, just to show you kind of what we're using to do sex estimation in the lab. So we're using the teeth, the head, the cranium, and the pelvis mostly to do sex estimations, as well as various other bones. But here you can see a really nice example of here, a way to estimate the age, and here how to estimate the sex. And the reason her vertebrae are shown actually is because if you notice the one on the left, there's this strange line in the center, right? And this is likely due to a herniation of the disc, which is also associated with a very stressful lifestyle, perhaps some sort of heavy load bearing, or maybe she was involved in a fall of sorts, but likely it was due to mechanical stress on her body. And this is interesting because it also shows us that both men and women were having these heavy mechanical stress. So it was not just one gender who was working within the community doing this hard labor, it was actually both. So now we're going to move a little bit to the Copper Age, where you can see the sex distribution data here, as well as the age distributions. And something interesting to note is in the Copper Age, we see a lot less infantile individuals. So children were not being buried nearly as much as they were in the Neolithic. Still, men and women are being buried on the same sides, but instead the pole of orientation flips. So people are buried from the west to the east now. So it's the same pole, but people are laid on the opposite way. And still fairly distributed in terms of sex, both men and women being buried. But interesting to note is the cemeteries grow smaller again. These necropoli are quite small. Here you can see at Via Guido Rossi in the Copper Age sector that there's actually only 3 tombs, which contain 4 individuals. Tomb 2 is quite interesting, and we'll go into that in a second. But you can see, again, it's a smaller burial ground, and it seems like they're burying only the elite of the class because the burials are very, very rich in grave goods. So, Tomb 2 at Via Guido Rossi. It's quite interesting because when they excavated it as part of the rescue excavations, it seemed empty. It seemed like this was an accidental deposit of bones. In fact, the only things present were a very small piece of the pelvis, a part of the scapula, and a very small piece of cranium. And originally it was hypothesized that, okay, this is just maybe a place of a secondary burial. But I would like to propose more of a ritual function due to this indent right here on the cranium. So the only piece of cranium that we still have that survives shows that this is an old individual. There's no sutures on the cranium. They're all obliterated, meaning that this individual is quite old. Due to the piece of pelvis, we know it was a female. And interestingly, there's this depression on the cranium, which is concurrent with a blunt force trauma. So this could have been a ritual sacrifice, which is why we don't find the rest of the remains. Perhaps these bones were used for something else. But the point is, it's not accidental that this happened. This is a direct trauma. And the other bones also suffer similar traumas, though they're very hard to photograph. So this one is the one I'm showing you. And it makes us think about, okay, why were these people being ritually buried like this? And why were they the victim of violence? There were still grave goods present in this deposit. So we know that this wasn't like killing and then throwing the bones somewhere. We know that it was intentionally deposited this way. But it's interesting to think of the fact that, okay, we have trauma and violence on this skeleton, but we also have it in the others in the cemetery. There's also a double burial, which I'm not going to speak about today, but there is a double burial. So this, of course, insinuates the fact that if these 2 individuals are buried together, did both of them die at the same time? Or was one of them killed to accompany the other into the grave, which we see later. Here I just wanted to show you one of the typical Copper Age graves. So you can see the nice grave goods here at the feet, and there were some around the cranium here. And this individual was juvenile, and so you can see that her femur here is actually still in fusion. So the distal part of the femur is not fused to the rest of the bone yet, which is one of the ways that we can tell age of subadult individuals. And you can see that the burial position also in the Copper Age changes drastically. Here we have a supine person. Prone positions also exist, and the burial position is completely uncodified at this stage. Individuals are buried crouched, prone, supine, kind of every which way. Also in the Copper Age, we have another phase at Via Guido Rossi with the introduction of bell beaker individuals and this idea of a funerary house. So here you can see the 2 funerary houses at Via Guido Rossi, where in the first one, there's 2 individuals, and in the second, 3 individuals. And what's interesting to note about this is the axis of orientation completely changes in the burials. Now people are being buried from the north to south plane. And men and women are being buried differently. So men are buried in one direction and women the opposite. They both face the same way. So men are placed in left lateral on their left side and women on their right side. So they're all facing the same way, but there's starting to be this sex distinguishment between the two genders. Interestingly, all of these individuals are old, and this grave shows a lot of beautiful grave goods, which we'll see in a minute. But what this is telling us is these are an elite class of people. This is by no means representing the entire population. And so these sort of monumental structures are becoming quite popular. And this leads to the question, why? Why do we suddenly see this complete shift in ritual practice and how they're being buried? Why are the cardinal directions changing? Why are these important things changing? Why is this new cultural fasces completely emerging with a completely different type of ceramic, completely different burial practices? And you can see here some of the grave goods I'm talking about, the bell beaker pots. And these individuals, they still have a heavy workload. We can see some vertebral trauma, some metabolic disease, as well as possible arthritis in the individuals. So even though they were elite, they're still working and they're still living strenuous lifestyles. So we can turn to the genetic data and we can think, okay, maybe these bell beaker people completely replaced the original Copper Age population in the Po Plain. When they arrived, we know that this influx of Yamnaya ancestry came during the bell beaker period. But if you look at the genetics, this is actually not really what happened. So here you can see, right here, tomb 1A. And this individual clusters with, so the way that this graph works, I'll back up, is that wherever the dot is on the plot is how related it is to the other dots on the plot. So if something is clustering together, that means they're quite heavily related to this population. So you can see other European Middle Neolithic and Copper Age individuals clustered here. And if you see tomb 1A actually clusters with them, which means her genetics are that of the original people in this area, the people we were seeing in the Neolithic and the Copper Age. Those are her ancestors. So she's still living there. And in tomb 1B, which is a male individual, we see that he clusters with the European Bronze Age. And this is interesting because the European Bronze Age has this influx of Yamnaya ancestry, which we typically think of. So these two individuals were buried together. We can assume perhaps they were a married couple of sorts, but they're buried in the same grave, sharing grave goods, very close vicinity to each other. And this means that there wasn't a complete replacement of this culture, even though we start to see no archaeological record of the past Copper Age people, their material culture, their ways of living. People were living together. And this is further attested by tomb 2, because we have a mixed population. This woman, she doesn't cluster either with the predecessors in the Copper Age or with the late Bronze Age. She has like this middle ground of DNA, if you will, which means she likely has parents from both populations. So these people were living, they were coexisting, but somehow this bell beaker phenomenon completely replaced the material culture and ritualistic aspects of the previous populations. This is also reflected in the osteological material, because one of the things that you can do with osteological material is if you have long bones, you can estimate the stature of individuals. And Yamnaya ancestry, coming from the Carpathian Basin, is associated with increased stature. And you can see, maybe it's a little bit hard to see, but the stature in the bell beaker period of individuals and in the early Bronze is actually, in fact, much higher than the Neolithic and Copper Age individuals. So we know that this influence of genetics is continuing in the population, even without having to do genetic integration of the data and doing genetic sampling. We can see this purely from the bones. So moving to the early Bronze Age, you can see that, again, we have kind of the archaeological data that you can find in the sites. And here you can see, okay, there are various positions, but what's interesting to note is this idea of females being buried in right lateral decubitus and males being buried in the left lateral decubitus are actually continuing. This phenomenon continues on, which isn't surprising considering we have this influx of new rituals and genetic material from the Near East. And in the sex statistics, you can see that there are both men and women, as well as children. You can see here a breakdown of how young the children are. And we have children of all ages in the Bronze Age. So this is different again from the Copper Age, whereas in the Copper Age in Belbeker, we see really no record of children. They weren't considered to be part of the elite. We are seeing them in the early Bronze Age. So here we'll explore two necropoli. The first one that you can see with all the tumuli is Centioroja in Parma. And this has 7 tumuli with a central burial and then burials in the ring ditches around the tumuli, as well as a couple burials in the very center in the walls of the tumuli. And we'll speak about some ritual aspects here. And then you can see on the left here, Roncola which has a single tomb of an older male who was buried with a dagger in his mouth. And so what I would like to focus on for the early Bronze Age is something quite interesting in my opinion. This is some research that I'm doing in collaboration with Elisabetta Capecci, who I believe is online here. So here you can see at Romanola Loch, it's quite hard to see because these pictures are from some older excavations, but in essence, we have children being buried inside jars. And this is the first time we see this kind of strange situation happening. There's multiple children buried in these jars, and all of the children are under the age of 5 who are buried in the jars. There are bones of children underneath the jars that are disarticulated and scattered, some of them burned, some of them not. And this raises the question, why are these children being buried in such strange ways? And in fact, if you look into it, you can see here at Centioroja, and what's not pictured is over under this pile of rocks here, there's a skull of a child of about 5 years old. And this is interesting because it's not the only case we see in the early Bronze Age. There's actually 3 different sites, and you can see one of them here over in Lucone D that have children around the age of 5 being buried in a completely different way. Their skulls are isolated deposits, and this is quite interesting because elsewhere in the necropolis, in Centioroja, for example, we have 3 children around the age of 5. One of them is buried completely normally in a ring ditch, buried equal to an adult. One of them is buried in a votive deposit with an individual about 1 year and may constitute a ritual sacrifice. And the third one is an isolated cranium deposited right here. And you can see that this isolated cranium is also in association with this tomb 14, which is a bisome burial. These 2 individuals were buried at the same time, and it's 2 women in their 30s. And you can see that one of the individuals had her cranium completely removed and replaced with a stone. Her cranium is not found on the rest of the site. It's nowhere to be seen, but this ritual manipulation of the body leads us to believe that perhaps there's some sort of cult of skulls, and this has been attested since the Neolithic, actually, all over Central Europe, also in Transdanubia. There's some evidence of a cult of the skulls, and it's typically related to a cult of the ancestors. I would like to raise the question, though, if it's a cult of the ancestors, why are children, especially around the age of 5, why are their craniums the ones that are the most isolated deposits? We have various evidences of children of all of these ages, of this age, being deposited all over the Pope Plain and also in Transdanubia. It seems like this ritual elaboration is not quite just related to a cult of the ancestors, though it absolutely could be. And what's interesting to note is on the skeletal material, there's no evidence of cut marks. So these skulls were actually taken after the body already decomposed. We have no evidence of the vertebrae being sliced. We have no evidence on the cranium of some sort of cutting of the head, which means this person had to be deposited, waited until they were completely decomposed, and then the skull removed. There are other ritual practices at Santiaroja. You can see here tomb 20, which is an adult male with some cut marks on his femur. These are repetitive motion cut marks that kind of go back and forth. And this could have cut through some muscle. There are no other cut marks in the rest of the site. I'm unsure why this man was particularly subjected to this, but it's perimortem because we don't really see any remodeling of this bone. So I'm uncertain if this man died from this, but we do know that he had some sort of violent interaction, whether that was pre or post-mortem. And here we can see the other 5-year-old I was talking about with a deposit of a 1.5-year-old, where both of these individuals were buried in the same deposit within Tumulus A, inside the mound. And what's interesting to note is half of the skeleton of tomb 15 is missing. There are no cut marks on the body, but only the left side of the body is present. It's also highly unlikely that these two individuals died at the same time and then half of one of their bodies were removed, also with the strange context of their burial within the mound, as this is the only burial, besides another 1-year-old, that is found inside the mound of the tumulus. So it seems like these children, up to the age of 5, have a very different burial practice. And these are the only individuals under the age of 5 at the site, up until including the age of 5 at the site. So this age of 5 seems to be a transition period for children in the early Bronze Age. And we can think about why this is. So if you look at the osteological evidence, here you can see hypoplastic lines on the teeth. And these lines, also called Harris lines, you can see are associated with ages. So these ages are ages in which metabolic crises events occurred for these children. And if you look at the age events, you can see that they were occurring between the ages of about 3 and 5 years old. And typically these lines, especially in children of this age, are associated with weaning stress. So we can think maybe this is showing us that pre-weaning children are considered one class of people, whereas post-weaning children are considered an entirely different class. Maybe this is why the age of 5 is so important. Perhaps this is the period in which children are starting to be weaned and are having metabolic crises events as they're not used to solid foods, and the solid foods do not have as much nutrition. So I'm going to wrap up a little bit this section and move on into a larger scale study, but kind of what I wanted to show you is through looking at these small case studies and thinking about the context in which they were found, we can see how people were included and excluded within their community, how different classes of people developed, how we can see an elite class or a completely flat structure of society. We can also see if women and children were treated the same as males, which is the case in the Neolithic and the Copper Age. But again, from Bell Beaker and early Bronze Age, with this new cultural horizon, we see a complete shift in this. Women and children start to have a stratification. They are not included as much in the burials, or they're given different burial rites. In the Bronze Age, we see a huge social stratification, where you can see these different various burial structures that seem to indicate different levels of prestige within the community. What is interesting to note is the idea in the Bronze Age and the Poplane up until recently has been that after the Neolithic, we transition to a patriarchal society where women are considered subservient and not given the same prestige within the community. But this isn't actually evidenced in the early Bronze Age. At Santiaroja, out of the 6 tumuli that have central burials, 3 of them are women and 3 of them are men. Perfectly exactly equal. In the rest of the site, the pattern is similar. There's both men and women. In votive deposits, there's both men and women in various classes of the society. And so this is interesting to think. While we can't assume that this extends to the entire period of the society or the entire community, at least in the upper or elite classes, as these are elite burials, we know that men and women were being given the same burial treatments, even though there is this distinguishment between the sex in the burial position. It's something to consider. Obviously, there's high variability between sites depending on the context in all of these periods, but by looking at these single cases, we can see instances of pathology in the community, like at Guido Rossi, where we saw that tuberculosis was present in the community, and likely other individuals had this disease as well, but we don't see it in the osteological data. And I want to point out that the dimensions of these excavations obviously limit the known data, and this is in just one small area. I looked also at the health conditions and paleopathology of this area, and you can see that they're quite changing over time. But in essence, the data shows a less percentage of pathological events in later time periods, which means that health conditions were improving for individuals through time. And we'll continue this later. In particularly, we see that diet and metabolic crises events are decreasing. In the Neolithic, we have to think that some of these events are not able to be seen because the teeth are simply not preserved. But what's interesting to note is this age of hypoplasia that we talked about for weaning stress actually shifts. So in the Neolithic, this age is between 2 and 4 years, and in the early Bronze Age, 3 and 5 years, which doesn't sound like a big difference, but it is statistically significant. So we can think about perhaps this age shift as being related to how the community was operating, when they were weaning children, how children were being included in the community, what was expected of them. And in addition, less percentages of individuals with dental disease can indicate improvements to the diet, which causes less dental pathologies in the later populations. And we know that in the early Bronze Age that the diet was improving with all this trade and the movement of peoples. So people were having more balanced diets. And here is just some of the continuous and discontinuous evidences that we saw. But what I would like to kind of turn your attention to is this was a small scale biographical study. The point of the previous study was to look at individuals, reconstruct how their life probably was, and then use this to inform the dynamics of the community. The following part, we're going to look at a more larger scale study where osteological data was taken into consideration in mass, so compiling populations at various necropoli from the osteological data, but using this to determine what type of health conditions people in these areas had at this time. And this research was actually in collaboration with Elisabetta Capecci again, and Viola Ciccioni and Claudio Cavazzuri, and we presented this at the EAA, and this is kind of an abridged version, just to show you the difference between the two types of studies. So here are the sites that we used. You can see that the chronologies go from the Middle Neolithic all the way to the final Bronze Age. So we're increasing our time period now. We're going into the Terra Mare culture. And here we're only looking at pathologies. So the first thing we looked at was infectious disease with specific infections such as tuberculosis and brucellosis, as well as non-specific infections like periostitis. And you can see here that the instances in the Neolithic are quite high. At some sites, of course, they are smaller, but in general, they're quite small, or they're quite large. Also in the early Bronze Age. Whereas in the middle and late Bronze Age, there's a significant drop-off. So why? Why is this occurring? Is it related to the data? Is it related to the preservation of the bones? Let's see. If you look at just tuberculosis, which you can see in evidence here of how we determine tuberculosis in the skeleton, you can see that in the early Bronze Age, there's not really any instances. In the Neolithic, we have quite a few. And in the Middle Bronze Age, we also have some. And these Middle Bronze Age contexts represent a very small portion of the population, but a very significant portion. We have a lot of samples that show this because the Middle Bronze Age necropoli are much, much larger than the previous time periods. And what's interesting to note is if you see one instance of tuberculosis in the population, you know that there's likely other cases because tuberculosis typically doesn't affect the bones in 90% of cases. So if you're seeing it in one person, as it's a very, very, very contractable disease, highly transmissible, it's likely present in the rest of the population. But in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, we don't see any evidence of this. As for nonspecific infections, we can think about the periostitis that we saw in the Neolithic, but again, we see a huge drop-off in the Middle and Late Bronze Age. However, in the Middle Bronze Age, we do see an increase in the level of violence. And when you have these traumatic instances to the skeleton, typically periostitis follows as the bone tries to heal from this. So if you're seeing increased instances of violence, you would expect to see increased levels of periostitis in the community. But this isn't the case. So why? Well, at Olmo di Nogara, we actually see some evidence of puncture wounds. So we know that there's these instances of trauma, but this puncture wound has some, I believe, okay, sorry, the picture isn't showing up, but at Olmo di Nogara, we also have evidence of trepanation and cranial surgery. And here you can see some tools that were found recently at the Termare of Pregato. And these tools are implied to be of surgical nature. So perhaps this falling instance of disease and nonspecific infections in the community is actually intentional. This is due to the advent of better medical practices, ones that are actually causing people to survive their injuries and to not develop these huge lesions or to die from the injuries. In terms of metabolic disease, we can consider parotid hyperostosis, cribrocrania, and hypoplasia. So these first two are cranial porosity, either in the orbitals of the eyes or all over the head. And we see similar patterns. Again, in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, we have severely decreased instances of this, speaking to, in fact, better health conditions. Here you can see some parotid hyperostosis, showing as small pockmarks on the skull. So we can assume that, and as well, cribro-orbitalia, which again, we see a decrease in these small pockmarks on the inside of the eyes. So metabolic disease is not affecting people as much, which means probably they're receiving better vitamins, better nutrients from their food sources, and there's less periods of hardship on their bodies. There's less periods of starvation or some sort of crisis event. We see this as well in the hypoplasia. So perhaps this increase of medicine is somehow related to these better diets, these better life ways. People are understanding health better. One thing to note is that in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, we do have crematory burials, which does make it hard to identify paleopathology, or it causes deformations at the bone that can be mistaken for paleopathology. So you have to be careful when you're looking at this. Here you can see a few instances of cribra in the bones, which is paleopathological and not a deformation caused by the fire. So we are still able to tell that this is occurring, but I wanted to let you guys know that this is also something you have to consider. And here we're moving to the Middle or the Late Bronze Age, just to show you one last context at Calzonalbo, which is a Terra Mare necropolis, which had 349 urns. And in particular, this group Q, which is from the Late Bronze Age, which shows a very strange mortality peak in children post-weaning. So we talked about the weaning, the effects of hypoplasia on the teeth. Okay, this post-weaning period is very critical for children because they're not receiving their mother's nutrients and their antibodies anymore. And if you look really at the distribution of mortality by age class, you can see that during this collapse of the Terra Mare period, there's a high number of post-weaning children who are experiencing either malnutrition or starvation, perhaps, because they're dying in these huge waves. And they are the most vulnerable members of society for this sort of epidemic. So as you can see, this was kind of a short summary of the work that we did, but not every type of paleopathology can be examined here, especially in the cremated burials. But the presence of both these specific and non-specific infections across multiple sites indicate that these health challenges were not actually isolated events, but are actually reflecting poor living and hygienic as well as food conditions for these individuals. And we can see that in the Middle Bronze Age, again, we have this huge collapse of pathologies and metabolic crises events, indicating that better health practices did occur. And interestingly, both classes of both elites and the poor were equally affected by this. So it seems that these better health practices were in fact relevant to the time period and not just to an increasing prevalence of monetary ability in the ruling elites to receive medical attention. It was something that was widespread across society. And I would just like to present some of the bibliography here and say thank you to the Superintendency of Parma and Piacenza for the osteological remains for this study, as well as the documentation. And also a big thank you to my colleague Elisabetta, who worked with me on both of these.
Right. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We were so hooked, and specifically, I was so hooked because I'm big on osteoarchaeology myself. So we will be taking questions now. But before we start with those, I would like to take a few of mine, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So my first one is about the snake in the cranium,
Yeah.
which had me at the get-go. Did you find any more parallels then? Because you said you were looking, you couldn't find it at the time, but were you able to find something like that replicated elsewhere, perhaps?
No, it's only in this burial ground.
Wow.
And it's 2 out of the 3 burials, so we know that it was intentional. Also, the way that they were placed is very, very intentional, as they're like kind of swirled down the middle of the skull.
Mm-hmm.
Super intentional, completely in situ. And in fact, the bones are so small that I think perhaps they are found at other sites, but since they're found on rescue excavations and these bones are so brittle, since we're not micro excavating the rest of the skull in the lab, we actually don't find them, even if they are present. Also because these skeletons from this necropolis are actually really well preserved due to the soil composition there, whereas the rest of the Neolithic ones are not nearly as well preserved. So if there were these small bones of the snakes, they wouldn't probably survive. So I think perhaps it's not that they don't exist other places, it's that we just don't see evidence of it.
I was also wondering if there are any sculptural evidences of people wearing crowns that look like 2 snakes entwined. And if that comes from a similar context elsewhere, and maybe that could be an indication of a ritualistic practice that they were probably taking care of at the time of death.
Yeah, I looked for this and I found some Near Eastern context, but we know at this point that we didn't really have Near Eastern contexts in Northern Italy, which is quite strange. There is a Moravian context that has a single bowl with a snake down the center that was placed near a head.
Okay.
And that was about the only description that I could find of any sort of commonality in this ritual. For me, I think that the more interesting connection is that there's another burial ground that I examined at Croce Azzurra, which had 3 burials, also of an adult woman, a juvenile woman, and an individual post-weaning, like a small child. And both of these were just 3 people buried together in the same positions, same age makeup, and they were both connected with production spaces. And the other one had some sort of like ritual fire pits.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that maybe it's not necessarily about the snake and it's more about this idea of these type of 3 people being connected to the production space. And then perhaps whatever the site is, they use some sort of different symbolic representation.
Do we also have any symbolic associations of mating snakes? Because you did mention that the snakes were placed in mating position in one of the burials. So is there any context for that perhaps that you could find somewhere? Or
no, it stumped me for a lot of months. I was searching everywhere. I was calling friends who speak different languages, making them search their sources, like, please, maybe you can find something, and not really. So we have 2 examples of those mating snake burials. But what's interesting is those are not found in actual like human burials. It seems like these snakes are a burial in themselves. Like they're within the necropolis, but they have their own grave just for these two snakes.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and they're found in two different sites that are quite far from each other, and both found in this position. In fact, in the skull, snakes on the skull, I'm curious if, in fact, the reason that they're kind of like this is
Hmm.
because perhaps there were actually two snakes there and they were like that, but we just don't see much evidence of the second one because maybe it was further from the skull and is a bit degraded, because obviously I don't have the entire block of earth that they were excavated from. I only have the small piece that was around the skull. So I think it could be something to do with that, maybe. But
It's crazy and it's
I know.
fascinating. It's something that I'll be thinking about tonight.
No, I know.
Trust me.
When we found them, Elisabetta was actually with me when we found them, and we were like, "What is this? What is this?"
I can imagine. No, no,
And
it's
when,
a fascinating context. Yes.
yeah, and when we found the second one, we were like, "No way," because we found the first one and we were like, "Oh, that's strange." The second one, we were like, "Oh, it's not just strange. This
Stranger.
is intentional. This is intentional."
I think the first time you find it, you're like, okay, maybe something happened here.
Yeah,
You know, like you
but I
maybe it's a
can't say
freak.
for sure. The second time, you're like, "Oh no, this is a pattern."
This is definitely happening. Yes. My other question is slightly more generalized,
Okay.
and it's for the benefit of all those who probably encountering osteoarchaeology and bioarchaeology for the first time. So, are there any diseases? Because bones tend to store a disease footprint, like you showed. Are there any diseases that basically surprised you? You didn't expect it to be that far behind in prehistory, but seeing that made you realize, oh, well, this is a long problem with humans, and this kind of disease has always been there.
I would say that the tuberculosis is a little bit surprising, just because this individual at Guido Rossi is, in fact, one of the most affected multiple bone tuberculosis cases in the entire world. Like, when you see multiple bone tuberculosis, typically it's affected in the spine and maybe a little bit of like arthritis in the joints and some evidence on the ribs, maybe also some evidence endocranially. But truly, every single bone on her body was affected in some way.
Mhm.
And to me, this means that she lived with this disease for an incredibly long amount of time, which is difficult to imagine how long she suffered and was disabled, because there was no way she could really walk, care for herself. And I think that for me, this is the most surprising, that people were also caring for her in the community, because I mean, tuberculosis is very, very contagious. So you have to imagine that these people who are taking care of her are risking contracting the disease. And I'm also more surprised that we don't find other evidence of tuberculosis at this site, because there are about 60 burials. So you would think, if these people are in such close contact with her, why are we not seeing more evidence of it? But I think that it just speaks to the fact that we don't always have evidence on the bones. It's the osteological paradox, right? If you see something on the bones, likely people survived long enough not to die from what you see on the bones, especially in cases of disease. So you have to think that there likely were a lot of other individuals infected. They just didn't develop as severely, or they died before their bones
Mhm.
could have this kind of pathological evidence on it.
I think what fascinated me about that particular individual is how well she was cared for, also shown in
Yeah.
the intentionality of the burial. So it
No, it
wasn't
was one of
just
the
somebody
most
discarded.
beautiful. Yeah. And you have to think also, it's not like this was an older man or something that, okay, maybe he had prestige before he
Yes.
contracted a disease. She likely contracted this disease when she was a young child because of how affected her bones were. And she was only about 20 to 24 at the age of death. So she was a teenage girl who contracted it. She was not, you know, some powerful leader in the community. Likely she was just a random girl, and these people really cared about her and venerated her, which I think is fascinating.
I know it's probably one of the best examples of how humanity and civilization developed
Absolutely.
in prehistory, and that's what we're carrying forward, because you are employing considerable amount of resources to care for this individual, which is basically a liability to you in circumstances such
Exactly.
as these. You're taking care of her, you're nursing her back to health, she's contracting it again, and you're burying her with such love. So that shows a lot
Exactly.
about how the people were dealing with her. So we have a lot of questions popping up for you. The first
Okay.
one's by Shruti Singh, and she says, what societal factors contribute to observed changes in gender-based burial practices and the increase in violence?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What societal factors contribute to observed changes in gender-based burials and the increase in violence?
Mm, it's an interesting question. I would say that it's quite nuanced. It's quite difficult to say, but I think that you can see these different practices. If I'm answering your question correctly, you can see these different practices, like the gender burials, um, as in two ways. You can say, okay, the reason that we have gendered burials now is because women are considered a completely different class. And this is kind of the idea that we've always had, right? Okay, well, women aren't being buried the same as men. They weren't considered to be as high of members of society. And we do see increased instances of violence around this time period, as I showed. But I don't know that we can necessarily say this. And that's what I kind of wanted to point out, because when you look at it, just because people are being buried in a different way doesn't mean that they're not as highly
Mhm.
respected. It's been a huge discussion for many years, because if people are just being buried in a different orientation and they're being buried with the same grave goods in the same positions, to me, they're quite equal. And these instances of violence, I don't think are necessarily correlated with this. I think that we see a lot more instances of trade and a lot more instances of mobility based on like the isotope analysis of teeth.
Mhm.
And so I think when you're seeing these increased instances of trade and mobility, of course, violence occurs because people are making contact with other people for the first time, and these exchanges are not necessarily peaceful. And I don't think that the previous idea where, okay, men took over and now there's more violence is necessarily true, because we still see instances of violence, for example, in the Neolithic, but correlation doesn't really imply causation. Like when you consider the fact that these Neolithic communities were very, very isolated. Even in the early Bronze Age, we start to see mobility, but from the Middle Bronze Age, we see intense mobility. But if you look into like the gender of the burials versus the grave goods, we see no difference. And so I don't think it's necessarily a reason of a societal shift with perception to gender. I think that it's more of like a ritual aspect. Okay, we bury women like this, we bury men like this, and that doesn't necessarily relate to how they were treated societally as previously thought. And I think this is why it's so important to kind of completely integrate this archaeological context with the bioarchaeology, because if you don't do this, you miss these small nuances, you miss the overall picture, if that answered your question.
I think it
Hopefully.
does. I think it does.
Okay.
The next question is from Francesca, our speaker from last week. And she says, can we see a change in the grave goods besides the different treatment of bones in the changing chronological moments you cited?
You can a little bit. So from the square mouth pottery 1 to the square mouth pottery 2, we see more grave goods. But I'm undecided about if this is actually a true changing instance of grave goods, or if it's that the previous grave goods were maybe organic material,
Mhm.
because ceramics become much more heavily used in square mouth pottery too. We see a lot more of them also in community settlements. So I think that this is also something to consider. I would say that the grave goods are quite steady. Of course, the types of them change. For example, in the Copper Age, there's a lot of shells and beads. Whereas in the early Bronze Age, we start to see the introduction of more weapons into the grave goods. And I think that this is kind of something that it's just cultural. Like, what do they value? What do they want to be buried with? It's not necessarily a changing of like who has grave goods, because they're both graves with and without men and women, children also, kind of in all the time periods.
I had a related question to that. So when you're encountering grave goods at the time where you said there is an increased evidence of trade and mobility, do
Mhm.
you also perhaps find certain grave goods that were probably imported from elsewhere in certain burials?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have various items from Alpine contexts. We have some Mediterranean-ish contexts. So, but to be honest, we also see a few imports. In the Neolithic, we see some peninsular Italy imports of the Serra Alto culture, but this is only in women's burials. So the idea has been either these women are making an like sort of imitation Serra Alto grave good, or they were being imported, but specifically they're only in women's burials. So
That's
maybe,
interesting.
yeah.
I mean, one is tempted to look into whether these people were important to be buried with imported goods, whether it was happening uniformly,
Yeah,
or whether the women were entitled to that kind of a grave good.
exactly. And I think what a next logical step is to do some isotope analysis on the teeth of these women. Unfortunately, some of the teeth are really, really horribly preserved, so it's really difficult to do that. But I think it would be interesting to know if these women were originating from the community or if they're external, because if they're external, then likely they were just coming from this area and bringing the pottery with them, which is interesting to think about. Interestingly, most of these burials that have the Serra Alto, which are, there's just a few of them, maybe 3 in all of the contexts, are buried in a different orientation, like they're facing south. So I think this is something to think about. Like maybe it's not necessarily that women in particular are able to have these grave goods, it's that these women came from this area and so they brought them, or they have ancestry from there maybe.
All right. We have a question from somebody who's facing a technical problem. So we're probably going to send them the recording of the answer. And she asks, she wanted to know how are recent damages on bones distinguished from archaeological diseases or pathological diseases in this case?
Absolutely. So it's kind of a silly answer, but I'll go for it. One of the easiest ways to tell is the color. So if you see like a break on the bone, for example, um, and the entire like inside is dark, you know that this happened post like during the deposition probably. Whereas if you see like a fresh break, it's going to be white in color because that part has never been exposed to the soil. And that's just like the easiest, simplest way to see. There's also the fact that when bones are fresh, so when they're alive or recently deceased, they break in different manners. So there's different sorts of fractures. And when you study bones a lot, you have to understand these types of fracture patterns. And so they can tell you if the bone was still like alive or had collagen in it, or if it's been deceased for a long time and that's why it fractured in that way. As for diseases, they look very different from like a scratch in the bone that you see when you're taking them out like with a trowel or something, or with some sort of small tool, because the diseases are typically like integrated into the bone. You can see that there's this like organic like kind of enmeshing of the bone. And there are like a lot of paleopathological handbooks that you can look at in order to determine like what sort of disease this is, because all of them kind of function differently. And that's how we tell, both based on the morphology of the new growth or the decay of the bone, or just based on which bones they are that are affected.
I think at the risk of sounding morbid, I've been fascinated with how arthritis looks on a
Yeah,
bone. So repeated instances of
it's
arthritis
very
on a bone.
interesting.
Also, I once encountered something. I once encountered an individual, really, who suffered from a long history of common cold.
Oh,
So
interesting.
perpetually common cold. That bone was very different. It was porous in a very different way.
Yeah,
You know, it looked like a honeycomb pattern on the bone, which is
no,
fascinating to look at. And then you sort of get very, very interested in it, and you also realize how morbid you're being because this is
yeah,
an actual individual
absolutely.
who
Absolutely. You're
suffered.
like, wow, this is so interesting. And but you have to
I'm
remember,
finding
okay,
common
this is a
cold
person.
interesting. That probably kills this guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, thanks for answering that. I think that's like you said, bones. Diseases appear very different in bones, and if you're familiar with bones, it sort of stands out to you that this happened to the
Absolutely.
individual while he was alive, or this is probably one of the causative agents of death. Somebody says, have any cremated bones been identified in any of the periods you mentioned?
Yes. So the cremated bones kind of start from the Middle Bronze Age. So with the Terramare period, we start to see the invention of the Urnfield cemetery in necropoli. And this is what I showed a brief slide about it. but this is something that's kind of new in the area from the Middle Bronze Age. And it's adopted in different parts of the Po Plain in different time periods. Some of them don't adopt it until the late Bronze Age. There are some overlaps as well, where some people are still being inhumated and some people cremated. And in other areas, it seems like the cremation rite just kind of appears overnight. And actually, something that I forgot to say earlier is we can also think about this cremation rite as perhaps not just ritual, perhaps it's a way of containing disease, or perhaps it's the other way. Perhaps because this cremation ritual was invented, it stops the spread of disease, and maybe that's why we have these lower instances of paleopathology.
Interesting. One last question, which is from Kiran again, and she says, can you recommend any books on paleopathology as an introductory guide?
Absolutely. Hold on, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can tell you really fast. I have one on my computer, truly right here. I think that the best ones to use, I think it must be White, I think, is the, so I'm sorry, I'm looking for it right now and I'm not having much
That's
luck
all right.
on
What
my
you
computer.
can do
But I think the most important thing is to use sources that have color photos, because a lot of the books are just in black and white, and it's not great. It's
never
not
helps with
helpful
bones.
enough. Oh, okay, here we go. It is Man and Hunt, the Photographic Regional Atlas of Bone Disease. And I think it's probably one of my favorite manuals, purely because most of the tables are in color, and it really helps you see the actual differences in the pathology. But obviously, various manuals exist. All of them are quite good and have their pros and cons. I think the most important thing is to consult various ones when you're doing something, not just accepting, okay, this one is the correct one, but in fact, you should look at multiple sources. Also, you have to imagine that these atlases of paleopathology are only using the most extreme types of the pathology. And so normally when you have the bones, in fact, you don't have this extreme of a level. So I think that looking mostly at academic publications, like once you find, okay, maybe I suspect that this, for example, is the paleopathology, if you look at various journal articles of other people, maybe in the same area, also in different regions, you can say, okay, they have this pathology. This looks really similar to mine. It's less affected. I can be more certain that this is something that I can consider.
Again, adding to that, I think also where the bones are deposited is a very big
Absolutely.
thing. Sometimes I've encountered a lot of bones in riverine contexts, and they degrade very differently from what you would
Absolutely.
find in a completely dry context, for example. So trenches located closer to the river, the bone just goes really bad, really fast. You can't even tell if it was a disease or if it's something the river water has caused. Again, the
Absolutely.
soil typology, so whether it's acidic soil or basic soil or a neutral soil, also affects the degeneration and sometimes makes diseases impossible to study. So bear that in mind as well. And one little add-on from my end would be work with somebody in a lab who
Absolutely.
deals with paleopathology that just clears your concepts even better. I think, again, like you said, if they're buried in different contexts in different places across the world, they may exhibit the same things slightly differently in their bone footprint.
Absolutely.
So if you're working with somebody who specializes in that area, there's just so much to gain.
Absolutely. And once you've done it for a while, I don't know, it almost becomes second nature. Like you see something and maybe you don't even realize at first. Like you look at a bone and you're like, there's something weird here. And I can't tell you what it is at first. Then I have to sit and think, like, okay, why do I think this is weird? Because at a certain point, it becomes kind of like when you're looking at ceramic shapes. If you have a sherd and you pick it up and you're like, this is amphora. I can't tell you why it's an amphora, but I know that it's an
Yes.
amphora. So it's just something that with more and more practice, you get better at doing.
Absolutely. So that brings us to the end of the questions, though I would love to keep chatting with you all day because this is a common field of interest again. Of course, I come from a very different area in terms of the interests. So I'm interested in it, but I've not really worked with them as much as you have. So I'd love to know more and learn more. So hopefully we can stay in touch about this.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
for
I'm
everybody
open for
else,
any emails. anything you guys need for any. Also, if you want sources for anything, I can send links. I'm very happy to do so. Please feel free to contact me.
I think what you could do is probably send us a selected bibliography of just basic material for
Yeah,
everybody. So if people in the talk who wanted sources, we could just forward that to them.
yeah,
And if
absolutely.
they want to look them up, they're welcome to do it. But thank you so much, Taylor, for the talk today. I think all of us had a great time listening to you. I personally enjoyed it to the very core. I was literally hooked onto my computer screen throughout.
Well, thank you for having me. I
Thank you
was
for
hoping
being
not to
here.
bore you guys too much. I
Oh, I
tried
would
to
I
find the
would speak
balance.
completely in a biased fashion because I'm a bone person. I have
Yes,
loved every minute of it. So I'm hoping everybody
thank
else has too. So thank you very much.
thank
And
you.
everybody, we will be seeing you very soon with another talk with an expert session, hopefully next week, next Saturday. And we'll be announcing that in the WhatsApp groups as well. So please register, and we hope to see all of you back again here. Thanks very much, everybody. Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day.